Vipin. It's really nice to be here with you today. Obviously, we get to spend a lot of time together in team meetings and preparing for workshops. But to be in this space, one-on-one, just chatting about the Enneagram feels really special. So I'm really excited for this conversation.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to it as well. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about, using the Enneagram in a business context, but could you get us started by talking a little bit about your own personal insights as they relate to the Enneagram and, specifically how they've been influential in your career?
Yeah, I was actually just writing about this last week because I was writing a little bit about my journey to Upbuild. And as I was doing that, I was remembering sort of how the Enneagram played such a critical part in that journey, in that transition. So I came across the Enneagram in 2013 when I took our flagship workshop, Excavating Your Ego. And I've said this to so many people that I literally think of my understanding of myself in a pre-Enneagram, post-Enneagram way. It was that much of an inflection point for me. And what happened, that weekend was really just the start of a long journey of exploration and self-understanding. But it felt like everything came into stark relief in that weekend. And part of what happened was I would tell my own story about how I've made all of my choices, especially from a career standpoint. And it was a beautiful story that it was very compelling. It was compelling for me. I understood why I've made each choice based on the previous one. And in that weekend, that whole story sort of unraveled, and I realized there's another story that's deeper and truer of all of my choices. And a big part of that was just recognizing how much of each choice and how many of all of my choices were really driven by a desire for other people to think highly of me, to think I'm successful, to think I'm cool. And so I look back, I could retrace my entire career from that standpoint and recognize that I've just been chasing claps from other people. And when I thought about what I really wanted in all of it, it was hard to pinpoint because it was really just a function of what everybody else wanted, what everyone else wanted for themselves and for me. And so I was just living a sort of a composite of that. And what struck me all of a sudden was I could picture myself doing that for another 20 years and being sort of the tail end of my career and feeling like everyone would look at what I've done and what I've achieved and think that I've lived a really good life, a good career, a happy one. And I would be left wondering what I wanted the entire time because I never really took the time to explore that.
Yeah.
That was a really powerful experience.
Wow. And I'm curious, what was like, once you've had that realization through the Enneagram, what opened up for you in your career?
So at the time I was a co-founder of a startup. Uh-huh. And 6 months after that point, that our startup was acquired by another company and worked there for a couple of years. And the entire time, those 2.5, 3 years, I was involved with Upbuild as an advisor, and I was getting sort of more and more subtle understanding of myself. But the ego has so many layers to it, and it runs so deep that
indeed,
yeah, even as I felt like I knew myself better, there was all this conditioning that made it hard to make a different choice than all the momentum that had carried me up until that point. So I was sitting here with my two co-founders from a previous startup, and we were leaving the company that had acquired our previous startup to start something new. And so I have all of these identities wrapped into this, that I was now a startup founder, I was a serial entrepreneur, I had to do this again. I knew what I was doing now, so I had invested all this time, and this next one was going to be even more successful than the previous one. And then there was something in my heart, I would say actually my brain too, I felt like it was being hijacked, where all I could think of, I was spending a lot of time thinking about what we wanted to start with my co-founders, and at the same time all I could think about was how much I wanted to help Hari and Rasanath reach other people, more people, with the work that they were doing, and impact them in the same way that I had been impacted. And so, but that felt like a really difficult decision to make, because, all of my fears around what would people think of me, how would they view this change in my career, were kind of, I was obsessing over, and were blocking my ability to step into something that I had an inkling that this was what I really wanted, and where I could serve other people in a way that was deep and meaningful. So the journey from the Enneagram in 2013, I mean, that's why I'm here today. There was fits and starts, and it took a lot of time. And for me, it took a lot of courage to take the leap. And, when 6 months into it, I could look back and say, like, wow, what was I ever fearing? What was my hesitation? Because it's felt so aligned with who I am and what I want for the world.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. And it speaks, really closely to my own journey as well. From an investment bank to Upbuild here. And of course, also the Enneagram was kind of the key reason I'm here. And all that identity and ego stuff certainly played out at the bank. And, to be honest, like, it's also playing out here a little bit now, as like I've moved into this career of being a coach, and facilitating workshops, and helping people reach their potential, and kind of being on a path which I think is more beneficial to the world. I'm also seeing how I'm like digging in my heels right now on this current identity, and getting sort of the claps both internally and externally from making this move. And so the Enneagram has been really helpful for me to actually see that. And even though it's certainly not a perfect it's not at a perfect place right now, there is a little bit more awareness than maybe if I hadn't had this tool and framework available.
Yeah, one of the things that I have been recognizing is that I'm so curious about how I will look back at who I am at this moment a few years from now and think, wow, what was I unaware of? And I've almost felt like I can look back every couple of years and cringe at myself for some of the things that I would have said and done. And I'm curious of what will I be cringing about maybe in this conversation that we're having, because there's so many layers of awareness that need to be peeled, that it's so exciting. It's exciting to see your own change and growth. To me, there's nothing more exciting than that.
Beautiful. So you obviously do a lot of work with organizations, and use the Enneagram as a tool in some of your work with them. So I'm wondering if you could share with me a little bit more about that work, and specifically, like, what are the kind of key things that you see in sort of average level organizations that they could really use the Enneagram to, help with?
Yeah. Great. So, well, one of the things I was thinking about, sometimes we have this conversation where someone on the other side is trying to understand what are the benefits of the Enneagram for an organization. And then I sometimes think, well, if I told you that you could have a tool where it would help people understand themselves much better, much more deeply, bring more awareness to some of their blind spots, bring greater empathy for other members of their team, feel more connected to each other, and more cohesive potentially, then I think, is anyone in a position to say thank you but no thank you? I mean, it almost feels like it's a kind of magical tool that doesn't really exist, but that's kind of, in the best cases, that's what we've seen happen in organizations. So a couple of very specific ways. When I was at McKinsey, we used Myers-Briggs a lot. And so we'd get into a new team, and the first thing everyone would do would say, oh, I'm an ENTP, INTJ. Okay, now we understand each other. Behaviorally, we know kind of how someone is more likely to show up in a team setting. I think what happens with teams and organizations a lot is that they don't really understand what are some of the underlying motivations and insecurities that are at play. And so we can operate more on a surface level, but when you really understand some of the underlying dynamics, it just creates an entirely different level of trust. And so with the Enneagram, you get a window into that, because it is not just about how people are showing up behaviorally. It is what's happening underneath that behavior. So that's, that is huge in terms of building alignment and trust in an organization.
Yeah. And I can imagine with leadership teams too, like there could be some politics and, different dynamics at play that people aren't aware of. And so in those sort of situations, have you had certain experiences with those sort of leadership teams with the Enneagram?
Yeah. Well, say a little more about what you mean, or what you're thinking about in terms of politics and how the Enneagram can help there.
Yeah. So, I remember when I was at Goldman, there were certainly, when it came to partner promotions or, even managing director promotions, or even just like kind of figuring out how to divide up the pie at the end of the year, there was always certain motivations that you kind of had underneath the surface, but weren't being said. And it was actually worse, even if the motivations were, not so pure, even if they were very selfish motivations, it was like exacerbated by the fact that the person just wasn't saying it outright. And it was sometimes very difficult to call, other people out, especially if they had some sort of seniority on you. And I remember like we did a workshop at Goldman with the Enneagram. And once I got a little bit more clarity on the different Enneagram types, even if they weren't, so forthcoming about their own motivations, I just could have a little bit more of an idea of what, why they were doing the things that they were doing, what they were solving for when they were interacting with me. And I certainly didn't do it all the time, but, every once in a while I could have a little bit more empathy or compassion, or just like let things go a little bit easier as a result of kind of understanding where they were coming from.
Yeah, this is great. So this goes to actually another point that I wanted to share earlier. Um, so two things. One is we talk a lot in organizations about motivating people, and usually organizations think a lot about how to motivate people. And usually you do it with a pretty broad brushstroke that all people, there's certain things that motivate all people. And so you apply those things kind of universally across the board. And what the Enneagram shows us is that, sure, there are some motivations that are universal in nature, but it's difficult to motivate someone when you don't really understand their underlying motivations. And the Enneagram gives us a real insight into that. So exactly what you're talking about at Goldman, where you can use the Enneagram to even if you're not having an explicit conversation about it, you can use it to understand what is likely happening that's not being said, and potentially use that to create some more security with the other person, or help them navigate what they're really looking for, if you have the authority or the power to do that.
Uh-huh.
So the other thing I was going to say is most people don't have, it's very difficult to talk about motivations and insecurities, especially in an organizational setting. And the Enneagram gives you a language, a framework and a language to be able to do that. So we have organizations that we've worked with that it always it gives me great joy to hear when they're saying things like, I'm having a type 3 moment right now. And that just conveys so much to the other person that it's almost like, short circuiting the larger conversation that you need to have, because so much gets conveyed and people have a sort of common understanding of what that means. And so and it opens the door to an easier conversation about motivations and insecurities. And that's so healthy, because otherwise you're reacting to those things, but you're not speaking about them. And so to be able to speak about what's really happening underneath is so much more honest, is so much more vulnerable, and it builds so much more trust.
Yeah. And the other thing is, like, it just allows people to be human beings at work. We're so often taught that it's not allowed. And if for some, like, the Enneagram just kind of gives you permission to be a person with flaws and insecurities. And I remember at one of these same workshops, there was a woman who came up to Hari and Razanath, who were facilitating the workshop, at the break. And she's a 4, and fours often have a kind of an interesting relationship with the Enneagram, where they often think in the beginning, like, how could any number, one number define me? And what is this personality typology stuff? Like, no way. That and they did the 4 presentation in the morning. And I remember her coming up to them at lunchtime with just like tears in her eyes. And this was at an investment bank. And like, I never thought this was possible. And she was just bawling, being like, I never thought anyone could really understand the complexity of who I am and, what I've been going through. In 15 minutes, you guys did just that. And I finally feel understood, which is, of course, such a relief for a 4 who is just wanting to be understood. And, to see that in a corporate environment was really cool.
Yeah, I love that story. I think the other thing that we experience not uncommonly is you start coaching someone, and then within 2 or 3 coaching sessions, I think we've heard a number of times the person on the other side says, I feel like you know me a lot better than you should at this point. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really a function of the Enneagram. Even if we're not using it explicitly, it kind of gives you a blueprint to what's happening inside, and it can really help direct questions that are coming up. And it is like a map. It provides a map of what's happening on the inside.
Yeah, I heard somebody talk about it. It is a tool for removing inefficiencies in communication and understanding, as you just mentioned. So, yeah, in an organizational context, especially one that's driven by, efficiency and communicating the most amount of information in the least amount of time, I can imagine that this is a really powerful tool.
Definitely.
So you've worked with a lot of different industries across finance, technology, retail. What are some Enneagram types that you find, tend to dominate certain industries?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, so I would start by saying, in the United States, we're in a culture that is, kind of a type 3 culture, an achievement oriented, the type 3 sort of archetype is what is valued sort of culturally right now. And it's been that way for a long time. And that culture is also translating globally. It's kind of this global type 3 culture. So, and then so that's the context in which we're operating. And when you look at New York, where we live, that is exacerbated further. And when it's some of the industries that we have done a lot of work in tech startups and in finance, you'll see even like that dial turned even more. And so we're especially, in the organizations that we work in, you see a lot of type 3 energy and a predominance of that type in leadership teams as well. And so in healthy subcultures, that can be, they're people who are genuinely seeing, something much bigger than themselves and are operating for the greater good and trying to serve each other, and very, very authentically. And then unfortunately, in a lot of sort of more average cultures, subcultures, and organizations, you see a lot of individuals trying to one-up each other to prove that they are the best, that they are highly valuable. It becomes a really self-oriented environment, even though everyone is talking about what is best for the organization. It's almost like, not necessarily secretly, but even sort of subconsciously or unconsciously, I'm optimizing for my own success more than the good of the whole. So that's one way I would answer your question. And then within, so we've done a lot of work with an organization in the beauty industry, and we see it's interesting. Their headquarters are in France, which is more of a type 4 culture. And you see in this organization as well, and in the beauty industry and the types of people that it has attracted, that we see a type 4 culture in the company as well. And we see a lot of type 4s that we work with in that organization. So it's just another example of, like, you have the Enneagram at an individual level, but then you definitely have it at an organizational level.
Mm-hmm. And within some of these 3 leadership teams or 3 cultures that you've dealt with, do you have any examples of maybe a situation where there was one individual or a few individuals that were not a type 3 that were dealing mainly with type 3s, and how that played out?
Yeah. We did a workshop earlier this year where I think we did it with the entire team. It was a organization with about 20 people or so. And I think that I would say 3/4 of the team were type threes.
Mm.
And as we were having the discussion towards the end, it was great because some of the folks who were not a type three spoke up and just shared very honestly what it has been like for them in this organization where they can quite easily feel like they don't have a voice, where what they have to offer isn't valued by the whole in the same way. And what was interesting is they wouldn't have, the Enneagram helped them do is articulate that feeling, because it had been easy for them to think, well, this is just about me not finding my voice and struggling to speak up or speak freely. And in the context of that workshop, help them see what was kind of more systemic or institutionalized in the culture of the organization. And the leadership in that case really stepped up and said, well, what are we going to do about this? Like how, and started brainstorming some actions to create more space for other voices that are not sort of part of this kind of just type three highway that they're all on.
Uh-huh. Yeah, amazing. And that's a good segue into our own organization. There's 4 of us, and 3 of us are type threes, and Hari Prasad is the lone type 4. And
yeah.
So how does that play out within us? And specifically, when you think about the diversity that Hari provides for us, what are the things that really strike you?
Yeah, so we have 3 type threes, 2 with 2 wings.
Uh-huh.
I have a 4 wing. You have a 2 wing, and then Hari is a type 4 with a 3 wing. So he also there's a lot of overlap on the team, and while he is a type 4, he has a big 3 wing as well, and I think that is part of the dynamic. And because my own 4 wing, I think it's almost a little bit more of a spectrum than like a sort of categorical. There's 3 threes and a 4, just to provide a little more background there. One of the things that I've seen on our team, it's almost, we call it 3 with a 4 or the 4 with a 3, a polarized type, right? Because the 3 energy can be almost an opposing force of the 4 energy, from a go-getter versus a withdrawn standpoint, and then also sort of where the 3 can so easily lose themselves. It's kind of the ends justify the means, and the 4 is centered all around authenticity and not losing themselves. And so there's this internal battle happening, and I think that battle that happens within a type that's a 3 with a 4 or 4 with a 3, you can see that play out kind of outside of the self in the organization in real time, and it's fascinating to see. So a simple example that I think happens in our organization is the 3 energy. The 3 of us are typically in a mode of just doing and moving fast, and moving before we're ready. We'll figure it out on the fly, and even sometimes like cutting corners where we think we can cut corners and just be more efficient. We're so focused on the reach and impact of the organization that that's our compass. That's the orientation. And I'm exaggerating this a little bit for sort of clarity, because I think it's not that extreme. But then on the other side with Hari's type 4, he's so clear that the question that he always asks is, how is this connected to our mission? Is so mission oriented and values oriented that he brings an opposing force to that 3 energy, where he slows it down and sort of asks more difficult questions that often we might sort of speed past and think, well, we'll figure that out. And at the same, so I really value his perspective, because his perspective in the organization, I also apply it to my own life, where I will often find myself thinking, okay, I can hear Hari Prasad's voice and and it helps to amplify my own forewing, honestly, and just like have a stronger moral compass in some ways. On the flip side, I think he benefits so much from sometimes getting nudged and pushed outside of his comfort zone to sort of move forward and move faster than he would be comfortable with. And so, and I think that has benefited the organization as well. So you have this kind of push and pull energy, and they both work so well in concert, as long as you really respect what the other side is bringing. So I think, there's been times within our organization where where there's frustration as well, instead of just sort of appreciation for what that other energy is bringing. And thankfully, because of our work with the Enneagram, we can bring attention to that frustration and then have the conversation about that, versus continuing to stay on the content of what we're discussing. And sometimes, like when I see this in other organizations, you can see that frustration. And, in places where we're coaching and we're working with the organization, we can help them to have that meta conversation. But otherwise, it's so easy to just sort of not see, what am I missing here? What am I not seeing? But just feel like I'm frustrated by how the other person is approaching this, and just be at loggerheads. Stop the communication, even shuts down, and you just keep brushing those things under the rug until they really kind of break. Yeah. That is, you see that over and over again.
I'm remembering a recent example where we were discussing the number of participants that we were going to have in the workshop. And, I'm working with a couple of healthy 3s, yourself and Razana. So I think there's generally pretty good awareness and thoughtfulness about this stuff. But, my own, I think coming from an average level of 3-ness, my own desire was to sort of, push ahead with like, let's just get as many participants as possible, because, and it wasn't like a purely selfish thing. Like I really had this vision of, benefiting as many people as possible. And I thought we were doing it in an online format. So like, let's just go, kind of the sky's the limit. And through both Hari's voice and also Razanath, had, and yourself had expressed some thoughtfulness around this, but like, I think Hari's voice felt loudest in this situation, was like, no, we should like really think about what will be the absolute best, most beneficial experience for the people. And even if that means only having, 15 or 20 participants, well, that's okay. And we'll learn from this experience and then we can decide next time. And it was so counter to, I think, how I had always thought about things. But once it kind of got fleshed out and talked about, I was just like so thankful that we could actually, you know, have this discussion as a team, and that this kind of counter energy, which is much more, you know, thoughtful, much more willing to take time and have patience, which is, you know, sort of things that I really need to work on in both my professional and personal life, is like kind of brought to the table almost every day that we're interacting with each other. So I certainly echo your appreciation for some of the diversity that we have in our team.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like there's a bunch of things to address here with what you said, like my own health, which I don't see as very healthy, and your health, which I see as healthier than you claim, but I appreciate your humility. And the other thing is just to be aware of not oversimplifying this, because like we can, even in what I spoke, it's like the three energy is to go faster and to do more and have more people, and the 4 energy is always to be slower and do less. Like I think that you know, it can be an oversimplification where ultimately all of us are aligned around how do we impact. So we're almost unwilling to like we want to reach as many people as we can without diluting the impact that we want to have on those people. And so there's always a question around you know, breadth and depth. And I think that it's not always that the 3s say breadth and the 4 says depth. And so it's important to recognize that it's a lot more complex than that, but there's some energy that is there that's consistent with almost that stereotype, should I say.
Yeah. And I'm seeing your 3 with your 4 wing play out live as we speak right now, like sort of having the you know, tendency or inclination to simplify and talk about it, but also the 4 wing is saying, wait a minute, it's more complex. We can't just put all of this stuff in a box. So yeah, that was great. So final question before we wrap. You know, obviously both you and I love the Excavating Your Ego workshop that Upbuild does. It was what, you know, inspired us to join, and it's the thing that, you know, we've done every year so consistently, and probably the most inspiring weekend of the year. What is your favorite part of that workshop?
Oh man, there's so many favorite parts. My favorite part of the workshop is it often happens in the panels, but it's not necessarily, it's not relegated to the panels. It's really when someone shares like a new insight about themselves and their own kind of validation seeking behavior, especially when it happens in regard to the workshop itself. So it's sort of this meta conversation where you're seeing how much desperation you have for a certain type of validation. And then they're referencing how it's playing out right now in this workshop itself. Like this happened in our last, we did an online Enneagram workshop in, I think it was in April or May. And I was so moved by this one gentleman who shared, he's a type 3, and he was seeing how much he's always needing to appear as someone who has it together, knows what he's doing, super smart. And he was talking about how he was showing up in that workshop itself, and the questions that he was asking and what he was contributing to the chat. And it was so just disarming. It was so disarmingly truthful. It was authentic and vulnerable. I mean, he shared a lot more about, he connected it to other times in his life and other things that he has done. And you're someone in your 40s and 50s who have, you know, you've lived a good amount of experience, and you're seeing all of those experiences in a different light. And it's so humbling to see an experience like that. It just gives me so much energy when that happens. It also, and then it inspires everybody in the room to aspire to that kind of sort of authenticity and self-understanding, self-knowledge. So that is, to me, whenever that happens, I could just like collect those stories and like put them in my pocket and save them for, you know, and we need to have a book about these stories, to be honest, because they're so inspiring to see and to hear. And this is the thing that it doesn't happen in our day-to-day lives.
Right. Yeah, it's so energizing. It lights us up. It's a beautiful thing.
It is a beautiful thing. Yeah. I'm excited to just, it just takes me back there immediately, and I'm looking forward to our next Enneagram workshop.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think this is a good place to wrap. So yeah, I'm thrilled with having the conversation with you and being in this space with you. So thank you for all that you shared. And I know everyone who's listening is going to get a lot out of your experience and your own vulnerability. So yeah, I feel a lot of gratitude for this.
Thank you, Michael. It's so fun to talk about this with you and to be able to do this. So I'm grateful for the conversation. Thank you so much.